Order in the court. The judge's gavel cracks through the tense silence, echoing off the polished wooden walls. The camera pans slowly over the room. Faces are tight with anticipation, some frowning, some whispering nervously. The older woman sits at the plaintiff's table, her frail hands trembling as she grips the edge of the table. Across the room, the two officers in crisp uniforms exchange confident smirks. And then, from the back of the room, a voice calls out, "Your Honor, I need to speak." The audience gasps, heads turning toward the source. A young boy clutching a Bible, his small frame trembling but his voice unwavering. The judge raises an eyebrow. "Step forward, son." As the boy walks toward the stand, the courtroom falls silent, the weight of his courage pressing down on everyone. I I saw what happened," he stammered, his words barely forming as his nerves began to betray him. "I saw the cops. They they dragged her out of the car. She was begging them to stop, but they didn't listen. They threw her on the ground." His voice quivered, but it remained strong, pushing through the terror that threatened to choke him. "I was there. I saw it all." His eyes welled with tears, but he wiped them away, refusing to let them stop him. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He paused, his hands gripping the Bible tighter, his knuckles turning white. He could still see it all so clearly in his mind. The flashing lights, the officers' angry faces, the woman's cries for mercy. I couldn't just walk away," he said, his voice barely audible now. "I had to do something. I had to tell someone. But it wasn't just about me. It was about her. It was about the truth. She deserves justice, and I wasn't going to let it be buried. The truth had to come out." His heart was laid bare for everyone to see, vulnerable, but undeniably brave. David, a 13-year-old boy with a heart too big for his small frame. Every Sunday morning he wakes up early, before the sun has even fully risen, pulls on his worn-out shoes and walks to church. His steps are light, almost reverent, as if he's always known that his purpose in life was to serve others. David doesn't ask for attention. He's the quiet one, the one who stands at the back of the room, his hands clasped in prayer, his eyes always seeking to help in whatever way he can. Whether it's setting up candles before Mass or offering a smile to someone who looks lonely, he's there. Without anyone asking. Without anyone noticing. But what people didn't see was the weight David carried inside, the way he quietly noticed the world around him. The struggles, the injustices, the pain. He felt it all. And yet, he never complained. David's friends might have called him shy, but those who knew him well understood. Behind his quiet demeanor was a strength few could ever truly understand. And on that fateful evening, that strength would be tested in ways no one could have ever imagined. It was a quiet evening in the neighborhood. The air smelled of fresh rain, and the streets were bathed in the soft, fading light of the setting sun. David walked slowly, his worn prayer book pressed against his chest, the edges frayed from years of use. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the stillness, his mind already focused on the evening service. He had always loved the calm of these walks, away from the chaos of the world toward the peaceful sanctuary of the church. But that night, something was different. As David passed the dimly lit street corner, his eyes caught something he couldn't ignore. Two white police officers stood by an old, battered car, their uniforms sharp against the darkness. And then he saw her. An older black woman, her frail hands gripping the doorframe, pleading with the officers. Her face was twisted with fear, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. Please, stop," she begged, her voice a fragile whisper, almost drowned by the harshness of the officer's orders. David's breath caught in his throat. He froze, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. His hands, usually steady, gripped his prayer book tightly, as if it could somehow protect him from what he was witnessing. The officers were unrelenting, their faces cold, their expressions hard as stone. Without warning, they yanked her from the car. She stumbled, her feet dragging helplessly against the asphalt, her body trembling in terror. And then they threw her to the ground. The sharp crack of her body hitting the pavement rang in David's ears. Her cries filled the air, the sound of a woman broken not just by the violence, but by the injustice she couldn't escape. David stood there, paralyzed, his breath shallow, his chest tight. He wanted to scream, to rush to her side, but something in him, something far deeper, kept him rooted to the spot. His faith, the quiet prayers he whispered every night, seemed so far away now, as though it had no power in the face of this. The world he thought he understood suddenly felt like a much darker place. How could he reconcile what he was seeing with the love and compassion he was taught in church? The woman's desperate sobs echoed in David's ears, and he could feel the weight of her pain pressing down on him. He didn't know what to do, but deep inside he knew one thing: something had to be done. And as the officers walked away, leaving her lying helpless on the ground, David knew his life had just been changed forever. The evening service had come to an end, the soft murmur of prayers lingering in the air as David stepped out of the church, the cool night wrapping around him like a blanket. His steps were slow, his mind still heavy with the images from earlier, images he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. The street was quiet again, the neighborhood peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But David's heart pounded in his chest as he walked home, a growing knot of dread tightening with each step. And then he saw it. There, lying motionless by the side of the road, was the same woman. Her frail body crumpled on the asphalt, her skin pale in the dim light of the street lamp. She wasn't moving, her chest didn't rise. David's breath caught in his throat. A cold chill ran down his spine as he stood frozen, the world around him suddenly feeling much too big, too overwhelming. Was she dead? The memory of her desperate cries, the rough hands of the officers pulling her from the car, flashed before his eyes. He could still hear the thud of her body hitting the ground, the sobs echoing in his ears. And now, seeing her like this, unconscious, unmoving, it felt as if the world had stopped. His hands trembled as he gripped his prayer book, the familiar weight in his hands offering no comfort. What should I do? His mind raced, panic threatening to choke him, but he knew he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't leave her there. His faith, his belief in justice, in doing the right thing, warred with the fear in his chest. What if the officers came back? What if they saw him here? What if they... No, he thought. She needs help. David didn't hesitate. He reached for his phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke into the line. Please, there's a woman. She's hurt. I think she's unconscious." His words came out jagged, his breath catching between each sentence. He felt the weight of her suffering pressing against him, as if every breath he took was tied to her life hanging in the balance. The operator's calm voice felt distant, like it belonged to another world, but it anchored him. Just for a moment. Stay calm, stay calm, stay calm," he repeated to himself, but it didn't help. The fear, the urgency, the helplessness, it was all too much. Then he heard the sirens in the distance, growing louder, and still, his hands trembled. He could hear the crunch of gravel under tires, the hiss of the emergency vehicle pulling to a stop nearby. David rushed toward the responders as they rushed to the woman's side, their footsteps heavy and fast. But his eyes were fixed on the paramedics, watching their every move, hoping they could do something, anything, to save her. And then, through the haze of his fear, he overheard one of the paramedics say, "She's in critical condition. We need to move fast." David's breath hitched. Critical. She was fighting for her life. "I need to tell them." His voice caught in his throat. He stepped closer to the team, heart racing. I saw what happened," he stammered, his words barely forming as his nerves began to betray him. "But what if they don't believe me? What if they think I'm lying? What if they don't?" His thoughts spiraled out of control. "I saw the cops. They dragged her out of the car. She was begging them to stop, but they didn't listen. They threw her on the ground." His voice quivered, but it remained strong. pushing through the terror that threatened to choke him. I was there. I saw it all. His stomach twisted in knots as he spoke, every word a struggle to push past the fear. His body felt like it was on fire with the weight of his own truth, but his voice, though trembling, held steady. He couldn't stop now. He had to tell them everything, no matter how scared he was. He had to make sure her story was heard. The paramedic looked at David, their face serious, and nodded. "Thank you for telling us. We'll take it from here." The next morning, David woke up to the weight of the night still pressing on his chest. He couldn't shake the image of the woman, lying lifeless by the road, or the cold, hard voices of the officers who had caused it. It seemed like the world had shifted somehow, like everything that once felt certain had turned upside down. And then he saw them, two of the officers from the night before, walking toward him in the quiet of his neighborhood. The air between them was thick with tension. They didn't have to say a word. They didn't need to. The look in their eyes was enough. David's heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his throat. His first instinct was to turn and run, to flee from the danger they represented. But he stood his ground, his feet frozen to the sidewalk as if rooted by something greater than fear. One of the officers, a tall man with a hard face, stepped forward. His voice was low, almost a growl, but David could hear the threat in every word. "You think you're a hero, kid?" the officer spat, his eyes narrowing. "If you testify in court, you'll regret it. You're just a kid. Keep your mouth shut and you'll be fine. But speak up, and we'll make sure you pay for it." David's stomach churned. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he said nothing. He couldn't speak, not yet. The words the officer had just thrown at him felt like a punch to the gut, the weight of them threatening to collapse him. How could they do this? How could they threaten me for telling the truth? His mind raced, but his body was still, frozen in fear. The officer's words echoed in his head, each one ringing louder than the last. What if they really do hurt me? What if I do regret it? But even as that doubt crept in, something else rose inside him, something stronger, something he couldn't ignore. David's gaze fell to the ground, his thoughts clashing in a whirlwind of fear and determination. How could I, someone who serves at the altar of justice and truth, stay silent about this? The question burned inside him, gnawing at his conscience, refusing to let go. David didn't flinch. His voice barely a whisper, but it held a strength he didn't know he had. "I saw what happened. I won't lie. She didn't deserve this." The officer's eyes narrowed, but David didn't look away. His pulse pounded in his ears, but in that moment he felt something shift inside him. The terror of their threats was still there, but it was now buried beneath a feeling of something much stronger, the need to do what was right. They turned away, their footsteps heavy as they walked off, but David didn't feel the relief he expected. Instead, his chest tightened with an internal battle. What happens now? But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to be silenced. Not by them, not by anyone. That evening, when David walked through the door, the tension in the house was palpable. His parents were sitting at the kitchen table, their faces drawn with worry, their eyes hard with concern. They knew what had happened, what he had seen, and what he was planning to do. His father spoke first, his voice tight with anxiety. "David, please, you don't understand. It's not your fight, you're just a kid. Don't get involved." The words came out like a plea, but there was an edge to them, a desperation that made David's chest tighten. His mother's eyes were filled with a mix of fear and love. "You don't know what they're capable of. If you speak up, if you testify, they will hurt you. And they'll hurt us too. Please, son. For your own safety, for our safety, you have to stay quiet." David's heart hammered in his chest. He could see the fear in their eyes, the fear they had never shown him before. It was a raw, painful thing, but what hurt the most was the way they were trying to protect him by asking him to turn his back on the truth that he had seen with his own eyes. "But how can I stay quiet?" David's voice trembled, but there was no hesitation in his words. How can I just walk away when someone is suffering? When something so wrong happened right in front of me? His mother's face crumpled as she reached for his hands, her voice breaking. David, I know you want to help. I know you think you're doing the right thing, but this isn't safe. We love you and we can't lose you. David's chest felt like it was being crushed under the weight of their worry. The world around him seemed to close in, suffocating him with the impossible choice they had placed in front of him. Stay silent and protect his family, or stand up and risk everything. His eyes filled with tears as he looked at them, but his voice, raw and full of emotion, spilled out without his control. I can't stay quiet, Mom. I can't. I saw her. I saw them hurt her. She needs someone to speak for her. If I don't, then who will? If I turn away, how am I any different from them? The silence in the room stretched on, thick and heavy. His parents exchanged a look, but it was clear that no words could make them understand. They loved him, but they couldn't see what he saw. They couldn't feel what he felt. David's voice cracked as he stood up, wiping away the tears that had betrayed him. I have to do this. I have to do what's right. I don't care if I'm scared. I don't care if they threaten me. I can't just let it go. His mother's shoulders trembled as she turned away, her hand pressing to her mouth in quiet desperation. His father's face was a storm of conflicting emotions. Fear, frustration, love. But none of it mattered now. David made his decision. And though his heart broke for what it might cost him, he knew deep down that staying silent would be the greatest betrayal of all. The courtroom was thick with tension, like the air just before a storm. The wooden walls seemed to echo with the weight of the moment. Every sound, every breath, amplified in the stillness. The judge sat high on his bench, his gavel poised in the air, ready to move forward with the proceedings. But the room was anything but calm. The murmurs of the spectators swirled, soft at first, then growing louder as the trial reached a critical point. Everyone was waiting for something, anything to break the heavy silence. The prosecutor and defense attorneys exchanged glances, their faces set in stone, as though they were playing their part in a scripted drama. Then, in a moment that felt both out of place and inevitable, the judge called for witnesses. Who will testify? He asked, his voice commanding the room. And that's when it happened. A single movement, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor, the rustle of fabric. All eyes turned as if in slow motion toward the young boy standing up in the back of the room. David, with his small frame and nervous hands clutching the Bible to his chest, took a step forward. His heart pounded so loudly that for a moment he could hear nothing else. The room fell silent. Not a single whisper. Not a cough. David felt every set of eyes on him, some curious, others skeptical, and a few filled with outright hostility. The officers in the room, the ones responsible for the violence, glared at him with icy stares, their jaws clenched tight. Their eyes said it all. Don't you dare! But David didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He stood tall, taller than he ever thought he could. His voice trembled, but it was steady with purpose. I saw what happened, he said, his words cutting through the silence. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the judge, with his gavel poised, hesitated before allowing the moment to unfold. And for the first time in a long while, David didn't feel afraid. He wasn't just the quiet altar boy anymore. He wasn't the kid trying to stay out of trouble. In that instant, he was a witness to the truth, a truth that needed to be heard. The officer's eyes burned into him, but David didn't look away. His grip on the Bible tightened, and though his heart raced with fear, his resolve held firm. He knew what he had to do. The tension in the room was palpable, every person waiting, unsure of what would happen next. Would the truth come to light, or would fear and intimidation win? David stood there, a young boy, but in that moment, he was more powerful than anyone in the room. David's voice was quiet at first, barely a whisper, but it carried through the room like a heavy burden. The entire courtroom leaned in, holding their breath. His small frame trembled, but his words, His words were stronger than anything the officers or his family had said to him. This was his truth, and he wasn't going to let it stay hidden anymore. He took a deep breath, his eyes glistening with the weight of the memory. "I saw it all," he began, his voice shaking but resolute. "I was on my way to church when I saw them. Two cops, white cops, dragging her out of the car. She didn't deserve what happened to her. She didn't do anything wrong. She was just trying to live her life." David's eyes welled with tears, but he wiped them away, refusing to let them stop him. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She begged them. She begged them to stop, David continued, his voice breaking on the words. Her voice was shaking with fear, but they didn't care. They didn't listen. His eyes clenched shut as he remembered the terror on the woman's face, the way she crumpled to the ground, her body a symbol of helplessness and pain. David paused, his hands gripping the Bible tighter, his knuckles turning white. He could still see it all so clearly in his mind. The flashing lights, the officers' angry faces, the woman's cries for mercy. I couldn't just walk away," he said, his voice barely audible now. "I had to do something. I had to tell someone. But it wasn't just about me. It was about her. It was about the truth. She deserves justice, and I wasn't going to let it be buried." David's words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, like a wound that had never healed. The room was still, but it wasn't empty. Every person in that courtroom, every person listening to his testimony, could feel the pain in his voice, the strength in his conviction. I didn't know what would happen. I was scared, but I couldn't sleep at night. I couldn't pretend that I didn't see what happened. The truth had to come out. David's shoulders sagged, the weight of what he was saying finally breaking through. His heart was laid bare for everyone to see, vulnerable but undeniably brave. He looked up then, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve, and his voice grew firmer, stronger. The woman didn't deserve this. No one deserves to be treated like that. And I won't stay silent. Not now. Not ever. The courtroom was still, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't the kind of silence that hid fear or doubt. It was the silence of awe. A room full of people had just witnessed a young boy, a 13-year-old altar boy, stand up against the forces that tried to silence him. And at that moment, David wasn't just a child. He was the voice of truth. And his words, his powerful, emotional words, would never be forgotten. The moment David's words hung in the air, a heavy silence settled over the courtroom. But then, like a wave crashing against the shore, the room erupted in disbelief. Gasps echoed through the crowd, sharp and involuntary, as if the weight of David's testimony had taken the breath from every person in that room. Eyes widened, mouths hang open, and the faces of the audience shifted. Shock, sorrow, anger, all mixing together in an emotional tidal wave. People shifted in their seats, some unable to look at David, some unable to look away. The murmurs started low, like whispers carried on a gust of wind, but they quickly grew louder, undeniable, reverberating through the room. The defense attorney blinked rapidly, as if trying to process the gravity of what David had just revealed. The prosecutor looked to the judge, unsure whether to continue or give the moment more space. The officers, the very ones David spoke of, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their confident facades cracking, their eyes darting nervously around the room. A woman in the front row clutched her hand to her chest, her breath catching in her throat as she whispered to her neighbor, "Did he really just say that?" Her voice trembled, as though she couldn't believe what she had just heard. Another person dabbed at their eyes, tears beginning to form as the weight of David's courage and truth began to sink in. The judge, normally a figure of control and authority, sat in stunned silence, his gaze never leaving David. His gavel lay forgotten on the desk, as if he too was struggling to grasp the full impact of what had just unfolded. It was a moment that seemed to freeze time. David's words didn't just fill the room, they shook it to its core like the ringing of a bell that couldn't be unrung. No one in that room would ever be the same again. And in that moment, the reality of the injustice David had witnessed and dared to speak out about hung in the air. undeniable, raw, and powerful. The defense attorney, a seasoned man with a sharp suit and a sharper tongue, stood up. His eyes locked on David, his gaze calculating as he prepared to dismantle the young boy's testimony. The room held its breath, bracing for the storm that was about to unfold. David, the defense began, his voice smooth and almost condescending. You're telling us you witnessed two police officers assaulting a woman. Is that correct? David's heart raced, but his hands remained steady, his grip still tight on the Bible. He nodded, his eyes unwavering, his voice clear. Yes, that's what I saw. The defense didn't miss a beat. You're just a child. How could you possibly understand what was going on? Maybe you misinterpreted the situation. Maybe you're mistaken. David's chest tightened, but he didn't flinch. The weight of the truth, the burden of his memory, steadied his resolve. I wasn't mistaken, he replied firmly. I saw what happened. I know what I saw. The defense leaned in, a smirk tugging at his lips as he tried to chip away at David's confidence. And you're telling us you saw all of this from a distance? You were just passing by, heading to church, and you happened to see this, did you? David didn't waver. He met the attorney's gaze without hesitation, his voice as steady as ever. I was close enough to see everything clearly. I don't need to be an adult to know right from wrong. The defense's eyes narrowed, but David stood his ground. The attorney's voice grew more skeptical, trying to undermine the young boy's certainty. So, you're asking us to believe that this was all exactly as you say? With no doubt, no mistake? David's lips pressed into a thin line, his resolve hardening. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm telling you the truth. She didn't deserve what happened to her. I'm not going to lie about that. The courtroom fell into a hush as the defense struggled to find his next words. His skeptical questions had hit a wall. David's calm, precise answers had left no room for doubt. The young boy wasn't just testifying, he was showing the world the power of truth, unwavering in the face of intimidation. The defense faltered. There was no discrediting David's courage. The room could feel it, the truth in every word, every breath he took. And in that moment, there was no question that David wasn't just a witness. He was a force of justice that could not be silenced. As the tension in the courtroom finally began to subside, the judge, his face a mixture of stern authority and quiet respect, looked down at David. The young boy, though still trembling, held his head high. The judge paused as if weighing the gravity of what had just unfolded. Ladies and gentlemen, the judge's voice rang out, calm but filled with weight. We've heard many testimonies in this court today, but none more important than that of this young man. The room fell into a reverent silence as all eyes turned to David, who, despite the eyes of everyone upon him, never looked away from the judge. David, the judge continued, his voice softening, it takes a rare kind of courage to speak the truth, especially when that truth carries such a heavy cost. At your age, most would have turned away, stayed silent. But you stood here today, not just as a witness, but as a beacon of what is right. David's heart pounded in his chest, but hearing those words, words of respect, words that acknowledged his bravery, filled him with a deep sense of pride. The judge's words were not just praise, they were a recognition of the enormous courage it took for a young boy to stand up to such overwhelming forces. Your testimony has given this court the clarity it needed to see the truth. It is critical, it is necessary, and it is an act of bravery we should all remember. The judge's gaze never left David, his words ringing in the room like a clarion call. This trial will not be the same without your voice, David. And I hope you know that because of your courage today, justice is one step closer to being served. After the trial, the weight that had hung so heavily on David's shoulders slowly began to lift. The courtroom had cleared and the verdict was in. Justice had been served. The officers had been found guilty. The young woman, the one David had risked everything to speak for, had survived. The relief was palpable, yet a quiet stillness settled over David as he walked out of the courthouse. He had done it. He had spoken the truth, no matter the cost. But as he stood in the soft sunlight outside, the magnitude of the moment slowly crept in. His legs felt weak, but not from fear. This time, it was the sheer weight of everything he had endured. He had faced fear head on and chosen to stand tall. It wasn't just the verdict that made him feel light. It was the realization that, for the first time, his voice had made a difference. As he turned a corner, he was met with a soft voice that caught his attention. David. The woman whose pain had sparked his courage, stood there, tears shining in her eyes. She reached out, her hands trembling as she pulled him into an embrace. You saved me, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You're my guardian angel. David's heart swelled with a quiet pride, but there was also a sense of disbelief. A child, just 13 years old, had been the one to change the course of history for her. He had been the one to speak the truth when the world tried to turn its back. And now, standing before him, was a woman who had survived because of that truth. She had been heard. But as much as David felt proud, there was a deep and aching tenderness in his chest. He hadn't just witnessed an injustice. He had lived through it, and he had done something that most adults couldn't bring themselves to do. I just wanted to help, David whispered, his voice soft but steady. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. And in that moment, he realized something that would stay with him forever. The bravery he had shown wasn't just about standing in court or testifying. It was about the quiet strength inside of him, the kind of strength that comes from knowing what's right, even when the world around you wants to silence you. David had stood up for the truth, and in doing so, he had become something he had never imagined. He wasn't just an altar boy, he was a hero. And as he stood there, a quiet smile creeping onto his face, he finally allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had changed the world. One small, brave act at a time. As the days passed, David's bravery began to echo throughout the community. News of his courage spread like wildfire, and soon, the very people who had once doubted him were calling him a hero. The local church, the neighborhood, even the quiet streets David had walked so many times. They all gathered to honor the young boy who had risked everything for justice. But none of it felt as important to David as the moment when the woman and her family approached him, their faces filled with gratitude and emotion. Her mother, tears streaking down her face, stepped forward and placed a hand gently on David's shoulder. You've done something no one else could, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You saved my daughter's life. We were drowning in fear, but you gave us hope. You've given us a chance at a future we thought we'd lost. David, though overwhelmed by her words, simply nodded. He couldn't speak. The words wouldn't come. But in his heart, he knew. This wasn't about him. It was about the life he had helped to save. The woman, her voice strong despite her tears, looked directly at David, her hands trembling as she clasped his. You've shown us that there are still people in this world who will stand up for what's right, she said. You are a true angel, David. You are a beacon of light in a world that so often chooses to look away. David felt a rush of warmth fill his chest. This wasn't just praise, it was a deep, overwhelming acknowledgement that his actions had meant something. They weren't just the words of a family, they were the words of people whose lives had been forever changed by his decision to speak out. As the community gathered around him, clapping and cheering, David remained humble. His head lowered slightly, his heart swelling with emotion, yet he never let himself believe the applause was meant for him alone. I just did what was right, he said, his voice soft but filled with a quiet strength. Anyone would have done the same. But the truth was, not everyone would have. Not everyone would have been brave enough to step forward, to speak the truth when it felt like the whole world might turn against them. David had done more than just what was right. He had done something extraordinary, and in doing so, he had changed everything for the woman he saved. He had changed the world, one small, courageous act at a time. David's story is a powerful reminder to us all that true courage isn't about age or strength. It's about having a heart that is committed to what's right, even when it feels like the world is against you. His bravery didn't come from a place of power or experience, but from a deep sense of justice, a belief that everyone, no matter their age, can make a difference. In a world where silence can sometimes seem easier than standing up, David chose to speak, and in doing so, he became a symbol of the incredible strength that lies in the courage to act. Will you stand up when the moment comes? That's the question David's story asks us all. When we face moments of injustice, big or small, will we look away? Or will we find the courage to speak out, to make a stand? David showed us that we all have the power to change things. All it takes is the bravery to do what's right. Share this story to inspire others to speak up against injustice. Let David's courage be the spark that lights the way for someone else to stand tall, to speak their truth, and to make the world a better place.